So this is the third video lecture of Chapter 1, Sociological Perspective. The last lecture I was talking about structure and agency and social location. I wanted to pick up here. So again, structure and agency is the idea that we have larger forces, larger social forces, and agency refers to our ability to act. Sometimes I'll use another example of when you came into the classroom, when you come into a classroom, that's the structure, like where the desk is, where the table, where the chairs are. That's your social structure. And your social structure predicts where you're going to sit. So the chairs are your agency, right? And then the rules about, or the expectations about, the teachers at the front of the room and the students sit and face the front of the room. That's also an example of structure. And the structure dictates how people are supposed to act. So this is a really important concept, and we'll come back to this one later on. Another really important one is this word right here. And that as I look at it, my anxiety wants to change that to a capital C, social construction. So social construction is a fancy way of saying that things in society are made by society. It's the idea that that society creates. So a good example of social construction is money. Right? Money is, at least money today, not historically when money was actually based on the value of silver, but money is this. We have a piece of linen, right? And it's been dyed green and it's got various colors in it. And we as a society agree that this linen piece of fiber, or these linen fibers, have value. That we have socially, as a culture, constructed the idea of money. And then we collectively reinforce that idea by how we treat money, how we exchange it, how we hold on to it, how we value it. I think money is even a better example now because so many of us don't actually see money. It's really like this whole idea of like cryptocurrency that boils down to numbers, rare numbers, right? These are ideas, I think I have to sneeze, that society has created. Excuse me. These are ideas that society has created, and then we treat these ideas as if they are real. Another example, actually a couple that we'll be talking about, is the idea of gender and the idea of race. Let me just talk about race to begin with, because race we consider race to be a social construct. That different cultures, right, all over the world, there are different categories or different racial groups, and the fact that a person of color, say a black person in the United States, might travel to another part of the world and will be assigned a different racial identity, suggests that race is decided by a culture. The whole notion of race, for instance, we'll have a whole chapter where we talk about how race is a social construct. The whole notion of race wasn't even a concept in the United States until about the time of slavery, when we were treating people differently, and we had to come up with a way to separate people who were free and people who were enslaved. And so we constructed, now not you and me, obviously, but then society constructed this idea that said that people who were of a certain complexion were different than people of another complexion, and therefore their differences meant we could treat them differently. We could enslave people who had a dark complexion and people who had a light white complexion. They were thought of differently, they were treated differently, they were valued different. So social construction. Another one I kind of like to think of is time. Time is an idea. We measure time, but it still is an idea, and different cultures will regard time differently. So there's this phenomenon called island time. And if you've ever traveled to a place where punctuality was not important, um, there, and you go to these appointments and nobody's there, because when they say 1 o'clock, they mean anywhere between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock, right? So it just emphasizes how some cultures value time differently. Well, another example actually is social class, that poor people's time is considered less valuable than, or people who have less social status is less valuable than people who have high social status. So think about when you go to the doctor, right? The doctor is the one who has the high social status, and the patients have low social status. Doctors don't wait on patients, right? They don't wait for the patient to show up. The patient waits for the doctor to show up, because the value that society places on the doctor's time is different than the value that they place on the patient's time. You could see the same thing even in a classroom setting, right? The students are more likely to wait for the teacher to show up than the teacher is to wait for the students to show up. Social construction. We'll talk more. I'll have other examples later on. So this is just kind of a catch-all slide, and basically it's to suggest that sociology is can be really useful. Some of the things, because the individual doesn't exist, we're going to be thinking beyond ourselves. We can use sociology to recognize how all of our behavior is determined by larger social forces. I always ask students, like, why are you here? Why are you taking this class? Chances are you're not taking this class because chances are, maybe this isn't true, but the general pattern is most people don't take it because they really want to learn the content. They take it because they need it to check off a box on their degree. They want to get a leg up and pay for and get it while they're in high school to save money. It was the only one offered during the time. There are other social forces that influenced your individual choice. What I think is most useful, and what attracted me to sociology, was this pearl right here, the third pearl, to be a part of social change. Um, I don't right now feel like I'm really involved in social activism and social change, but certainly I have been over my adult life. But once you understand and recognize that your behavior influences other people's behavior, which then can create a larger social force. It's very difficult to just sit on the sidelines and not be a part of social change. Because this is a big picture discipline, right? Recognize larger global processes. It's in the relatively privileged part of the world, we're not as sensitive to what's going on in other parts of the world, right? To recognize, for instance, if you had coffee or a banana this morning, today, that you are in an economic arrangement with global relationships. Anyone know where coffee is grown in the United States? Only one kind, and that's in Hawaii. If you Chances are the coffee you drank this morning was grown in another part of the world. I don't really like this one. I keep meaning to change, promote understanding and tolerance. Tolerance, I don't think, is good enough. We need to be more than just tolerant of differences. We need to be embracing, celebrating differences. This term here, evaluate, should actually be probably in air quotes. Sociologists strive to be value-free, though one could argue, is that even possible in the human condition to be value-free? But one of the things that you'll hear me say repeatedly is, from the sociological perspective, there is no right and wrong. There are simply patterns. We will talk about patterns, and then we can talk about the consequences of those patterns. And in that sense, we might be saying that these consequences benefit this group of people, and these consequences benefit this group of people. For instance, economic policy, right? Economic policy, the pattern is that it typically benefits wealthy people and it disenfranchises poor people. You can decide in your moral compass if that's good or bad, but the sociological perspective simply points out the relationship between these patterns. A couple really important terms or points are these last two. Sometimes you'll hear sociology described as that call to look again, and that's when, like in the previous lecture, when I ask you to look at the patterns, you might go look around and say, I don't see them, but look again, look more closely, or maybe take a bigger picture, right? Instead of looking just at the two people sitting next to you, what if you go to the door and you look at the bigger picture, right? Um, Along those lines, I have sometimes used the example of when we first moved. I live in Manhattan. When we first moved to Manhattan, we lived out in the country and we had no neighbors, right? And we lived out in the middle of this farmer's field. And you could look up into the sky and you could see the storms like moving in, right? You could just see for miles, I don't know how far, but you could see storms moving across the sky. Then we moved to town, and when where we live downtown, we look straight up and all you see is this little square of the sky, right? It's the same sky, but I don't have as big a picture. And I would describe the weather differently based on this one little chunk of sky that I would describe it being out in the country and seeing. It's kind of like I think about this actually in my commute. The weather patterns can be different between Salina and Manhattan. And because I get this 75-mile perspective, the weather looks different than if I was just in Manhattan or just in Salina. So look again. Is that really what it is? It could shift your perspective a little bit. And finally, you've heard me talk about this one already. It's the way of connecting your personal troubles, what you're experiencing in your personal life, with larger social forces, with larger public issues. And again, I'm going to emphasize that from the sociological perspective, there's no such thing as an individual, right? That we all are making choices, like one by one choices, but those choices are profoundly limited and structured by larger social forces that we may not see because we haven't been encouraged or we don't have the imagination. If we look again, maybe we'll see it. So I'm going to stop right here. End of lecture 3.